Hello and welcome to the VES Autodesk Ask Me Anything VFX Pros Tell All webcast with our special guest, Chris White, Visual Effects Supervisor at Wētā Digital. I'm Naomi Goldman, VES Communications Director, and happy to serve as your moderator today. We're delighted that you're joining us for this series of conversations with leading visual effects professionals brought to you by the Visual Effects Society, the industry's global honorary society, and Autodesk, worldwide leaders in 3D design, engineering, and entertainment software. Through our webcasts, you have an exclusive audience with successful visual effects professionals from diverse backgrounds and a forum to hear their career insights and words of wisdom. We hope this will inspire you on your career journey and encourage you to explore the dynamic visual effects industry, rich with artists, executives, and innovators. Today's guest has a lot of great tales from the journey to share with you. Visual Effects Supervisor Chris White has put his 25 years of film experience to use, creating compelling digital environments, characters, and effects for some of the most significant VFX films of recent times. Chris masterminded the complex Goblin Caverns environment for The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, and led the creation of the photorealistic chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas that were the stars of Rise of the Planet of the Apes. His work as a visual effects supervisor on Rise of the Planet of the Apes and The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey were each nominated for both a BAFTA and an Academy Award for visual effects, and he's also the recipient of 4 VES awards. His credits as a VFX supervisor also include Maze Runner, The Scorched Trials, Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, and Maze Runner: The Death Cure. And Chris is currently working on James Cameron's Avatar sequels and the new season of The Umbrella Academy. Just a few housekeeping details. The webcast will run about an hour plus. It's being recorded and will be available later on the VES and Autodesk websites and on our social media channels. We'll post them at the end of the session. If you're following on Zoom and would like to ask Chris a question, please go to the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, click Q&A and type in your question. And if you're on Facebook Live, enter your question as a comment. We can't promise we'll get to them all, but we'll do our best. All right. Chris is on deck joining us from Wellington, New Zealand, and we are ready to begin. Hello, Chris. How are you today?
Good. How are you doing, Naomi?
Very good. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. Where I like to start is a little bit about your origin story. Can you tell us a little bit about growing up outside of Washington, D.C. and, you know, early memories of film or TV entertainment that captivated you and some of those early reflections?
Growing up, outside DC, like you mentioned, you know, I grew up in a time of all these classic special effects films, Star Wars trilogy, all of those that kind of caught my attention. I mean, I never really thought that I could work in special effects at the time, but we grew up in this era where 3D graphics was starting to grow, did a lot on computers and did a lot of work in the arts, and started to look at studying that one day. I originally thought I was going to go into computer science, but saw this great program at George Washington University that kind of led me toward the 3D graphics direction. Yeah.
I'm gonna take you back a little bit earlier before we go to school. You know, you wrote a lovely piece in Variety a few months ago, reflecting on Black History Month, and you shared some of your reflections on some of the inspiration and early learnings that you got from your father. I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit.
It was my father was a programmer and he was a woodworker. He was an artist. So when we were really young, he would start teaching us computers like at a pretty early age. Like he actually had my brother and I would sit in the back of some of the community college classes he was teaching about programming. We'd sit back there and sit behind some of the other professors' classes. And so we learned coding at a pretty young age. So we had that introduction. And then, like I said, he was also a woodworker. So he'd build all the different podiums and pews for our church. So he was constantly kind of talking to us about aesthetics and art and crafting in wood. So we got this combination of both, introduction, which is why it ended up becoming a perfect career for me, because it mixes both sides of your brain.
Do you have any recollections of particular films or TV shows that captivated you when you were young?
Yeah, I mean, definitely Star Wars, that was something that I think everybody can kind of point to. But I also liked like some of the shows like Automan. There's a show on in the 80s that I really liked, and Indiana Jones and that whole trilogy, which was Ghostbusters, which was the thing that was kind of exciting about working at ILM, is that you would go in and see remnants and props from all those films that you grew up loving.
So you went to George Washington University and you were originally studying computer art and science. And I know that you had almost an accidental pathway. You had an extracurricular activity that kind of gave you the gateway. Can you talk a little bit about that internship pathway?
Yeah, so George Washington University was a program that it was like a summer program for high school students to start looking at different careers. And there was a professor there who showed some rigid body dynamics and some 3D graphics, which I saw, and immediately I just knew that's what I wanted to do. Like, it was just like a spark seeing that. And from that, I switched my applications for universities and went and applied for Syracuse University, which was a computer art, and it was under the School of Art, and it was an art degree, but we also took computer science classes. And it was from that I started to get into that part of the artistic graphics.
So tell us a little bit about how you got the internship at ILM.
Yeah, so the internship was, I applied for that 4 times. There was a bit of persistent, because I had friends that had gotten it. They told me about how great it was. And in each year I applied over and over again, always getting close, but never actually getting it. And it was I think my 4th time when I was working in the university, working on my master's degree at University of Illinois, Chicago at the EVL lab, that I was able to get the internship. And it was actually perfect that year because a lot of the work I was doing was in virtual reality and vortices and particle systems, and they had just landed the film Twister. So my internship was actually on the film Twister.
Making digital tornadoes?
Yeah. It was a great internship because it wasn't, just getting coffee or, clearing out videotapes. It was like immediately from the first day, I had these great supervisors and producers that were like, okay, start writing code, start helping us develop the software. So they were working out all the algorithms and everything for the tornadoes. And I was creating this software that would allow the TDs to build and manipulate the tornadoes from an artistic way so that they didn't have to dig so much into the code. And this is way back in the days of Dynamation, pre-Maya, back in then. So it was a great internship, and it was a fun project.
And can you talk about how that evolved into your job?
Yeah, it was after that I got the I continued working at ILM, working on films like Mars Attacks and Perfect Storm and some Jurassic Park films. So I kept with the effects side of things. I kept doing that for years, and was with ILM for 8 years before going back to Chicago for a little bit, and then coming down to New Zealand to work on Return of the King at Wētā Digital. And then that brought me here, which I've been here ever since, which I think is about 18 years, maybe. It's yeah.
I know that I saw in another interview when you were asked about your experience with mentors, there was an experience about, you mentioned your brother sending you some of your old sketchbooks and trying to sort of look back. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience was coming up in the field? What kind of mentorship you had, and how were you helped on your career trajectory?
Yeah, I was going through some of those sketchbooks, like you said, and it's pretty interesting actually. I'd advise like anybody, if you have the time, to keep those old notes and sketches, because it's going back to seeing some of those things from, like I said, from Twister or Mars Attacks. It's great to see my own personal notes. One of the things when I first got the internship, I had thought I had, yeah, like naively had thought I had done all I could do with particles, and then once I got the ILM internship, I realized I hadn't scratched the surface. I was working with Henry Labonta and Habib Zargapur, and they were mentoring me on, different ways to think about things, how to solve these problems, how to create, tools and stuff to share that knowledge with all the other artists, and to allow them to work. So they were great mentors, taking me through different problem solvings, and I actually saw some of that in some of the notes that I had within those sketchbooks.
So
And
given how, mentors opened some doors for you,
Mhm.
what kind of sense of responsibility, or tell me about your involvement now as a mentor, given your senior role in the industry?
Yes. I have a couple interests in mentoring. I mean, I try and mentor as much as I can throughout work, but also on the side, we've been exploring mentoring with some of the university students. We've started to do these portfolio reviews through this inclusion effects group that I'm with, which is it's a great way to actually work with some of the students while they're still working on their portfolios. So we look at it, we give them some advice, give them career advice, just assist in any way that we can. Because one thing when I was in university, I always kind of wished that, I knew more about the industry before I got out, that I was able to speak with some of the professionals. So that's what we've been doing as well. And it's been great on both sides. It's always great work with the students because of their enthusiasm and their fresh ideas. So it's something we've been doing a lot, and we want to keep continuing to do.
People ask this all the time. What do you look for in a portfolio, and what kind of advice do you give to students and people at that early part of their career who are aspirational?
Yeah, there's a couple things I look for, like in a portfolio. It's good for students to kind of define which of their areas of interest. If you're an animator or a lighter, like use the university to find your path, but then from that, focus on and with your portfolio, you can tell what area you're focusing on. So I think that's an important part. But the big thing I would say is I saw some great portfolios at FMX this year, and the ones that really stuck out were the ones that you could see the story and the thinking behind their work. There was one portfolio where she was describing a room, and you could tell from everything that she modeled that everything had a significance. Why was this chair there? What was the color of the chair? How it was painted, all the detail. So as you're putting together your portfolio, it's a big part of our job that we're actively telling a story for a director. We're trying to make sure there's a story in everything we create. So you want to do that in your portfolio as well. And it's also a good technique that if you ever get stuck on what to do or how to create something, think about what's the story behind it. If you're creating trees, what type of trees they are. If you're creating, a spaceship, every detail has some kind of story behind why it is there. So that's the big thing I look for in portfolios, when you can look at it and the artist can speak to the decisions that they made.
One of the things we talked about was, I'm not sure if the word is demystifying the job, but talking a little bit about the science and the research, and whether you're working with physicists or other experts, when you're trying to kind of develop your work. Can you talk a little bit about the research end of your job?
Yeah, yeah, I could talk for probably quite a while about that. That's another part. Going to your earlier question about what's good to see in a portfolio, that research part is also great to see, because there's so much of our jobs is actually researching the things we are creating. Like I mentioned, if you're doing plants, we'll research how those plants grow, how do they work, where does the light come from, all those different aspects, and that's working with programmers and physicists and scientists and all different types of artists and technicians from different technical backgrounds. So I encourage students to put that in their portfolio, but it's also something we do every day. And it's great. It's probably actually one of the more interesting things about the job as well, is that with each project, you're researching and learning something new. You know, you could be working on a creature, so you're delving into the eyes and how eyes work and all those little details that make your work very realistic.
Okay, well, since you mentioned creatures and some of the work, let's talk about some of the films that you've worked on. If you want to share any kind of standout challenges or experiences.
Yeah.
I know one that was pivotal for you was King Kong and working on Digital New York. What would you like to share from that experience?
Yeah, I would say that was probably my biggest research project. I was a CG supervisor at the time. And the biggest challenge that I had at it was that we were creating all of Digital New York in 1933. And we wanted to do this as a complete 3D build. So it was probably about 2 years of programming and coding and research on my point of view, like researching all of New York at that time, using old fire maps, using all kinds of things. And I look like I have a little cat in the background there. And building this entire digital city. And that was, so that was a big challenge, and we were super happy with the results. And it was something that was probably like I said, one of my biggest challenges for the career, but also one of the most rewarding, of seeing this kind of city grow from almost from nothing, when we kick off the build each night as we were rebuilding the city.
I know another pivotal one was Return of the King.
Yeah.
How was that experience significant for you? What stands out in terms of also challenges that you had to overcome?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenges with that was I was new to New Zealand. I came in on Return of the King to work on the Black Gates and their destruction. So that was the biggest challenge. There was coming in toward the kind of the later half of the project and working with software and developing shaders to have the gates crumble. And that was what had brought me to New Zealand, was seeing the amazing work that had done on 2 towers and the work that was created for Gollum, and all that entire project.
Peter Jackson is one of several visionary directors that you have spent time with over the years. Peter Jackson, James Cameron, we'll talk about in a few minutes. What is important for you as a visual effects supervisor to be successful in achieving the artistic vision of these directors on epic cinematic projects?
Yeah, I think that I mean the challenge always is that you want to make sure that you can complete their vision, like to be able to realize that all the things that they're trying to put into their story. Our job ultimately is to help further the story and tell the story for the audience and bring the audience into it. But also part of that I would include is that it's important to offer them options, as you're working and realizing their vision, but also offer them options as to things that you may have discovered as you're working through the piece that they may want to bring into their work. So I think that is probably the biggest things. Those are 2 of the biggest things that you want to do as a visual effects supervisor.
Since I mentioned Goblin's Cavern in the upfront, someone asked, how were you able to make such an expansive cavern system in The Hobbit? And did you copy or reuse assets while making the Goblin Cavern?
Yes. One of the big parts of Goblin Cavern was the actual design of the walls and the structures. It was supposed to have this very crude thing that is kind of disgusting, and it was this pumicey, pitted wall surfaces. And we tried different techniques of hand modeling that and procedurally modeling it. And one of the things that actually worked really well was going in and hand sculpting those shapes, having a modeler go in and physically model. We don't talk as much about how much, you hear a lot about the digital aspect of a lot of the work we do, but there's also a practical aspect, and some of the art directors sculpted out all those individual pieces. And then our amazing layout department, after we had a library of those, would put them into different shapes and forms to create the look. And because it's such a very spiky structure, if you look at the Goblin Caverns, those spikes were hand placed and positioned to help aid in the composition of the pieces. So if there is something important to be viewed in the bottom left-hand corner, a lot of the spikes would point and direct your eye to that area of that point of action. So each view and each scene actually is sculpted to produce a certain compositional result.
Okay, moderator point of privilege here. Can you
Yeah.
please talk a little bit about also the work that went into creating the very realistic chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas for Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and anything you want to share about how that evolved, you know, across the trilogy, quite frankly, in terms of as technology evolved?
Yeah, I can talk a bit about that. You know, we first started our big digital ape started on Kong, and we learned a lot through that show. But with you know, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, we had a lot of different main characters speaking eventually, you know, toward the end. And a lot of the work that we did was just really going in and researching apes, you know, from the inside out. So we had a relationship with the Wellington Zoo, and some of the apes are based on ones that were actually at the zoo at the time, and they would come in, we would speak to them, we'd talk about ape movement. We would also use some of their photographs, and they would have medical records for when they were working with chimps, and chimps had gotten sick and they had to take MRIs. So all of that was built into making them, you know, super realistic. And then throughout the trilogy, it continued to evolve. We learned more about how to render the fur. Toward the last couple apes, the fur rendering was even greatly improved by putting in all the medulla and the structure within inside the fur itself, so that even when you backlight some of the chimps, that it got a great realistic result. So the technology continued to evolve, and you can see, you know, how amazing it looks on the last couple of films, all the rich detail we're able to get out of them.
Okay, well, let's keep in that vein. I've heard one of your collaborators talk about, you know, we are Wētā and we do apes. You have also worked on the Umbrella Academy, kind of creating Pogo. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that character was brought to life and what attracted you to that project.
Yeah, Umbrella Academy, that's, you know, it's been a great project that we've worked on for a couple years now. And it's, with Pogo, he was a little bit different because he was even more sentient, more kind of human type of chimp, after you see in season 2 how that came to evolve. And him working right alongside with the other actors. So that one kind of evolved, taking all the lessons that we learned from earlier chimp films and applying that, but also working in a new medium with streaming media. That was the first time I had worked on a television show. So it was a different challenges of coordinating times and the episodes, but it was a great response, and there's a huge fan base for Umbrella Academy. So that's been you know, extra rewarding because people are really into it. Yeah.
And then you and Aiden Martin, one of your sort of collaborators, have created Marcus the chimpanzee for Steve Carell and Greg Daniels' Netflix comedy Space Force. So how do you move from, you know, ape or chimpanzee and kind of make them kind of different? What was the experience about creating that character for Space Force?
Yeah, Space Force was really interesting because I had never worked on a comedy before. And it was great, you know, working with the crew over there with Space Force, because the showrunner would give us directions on these different comedic moments, like what is the audience, you know, where's the audience when they're getting a little bit ahead of you and ahead of the characters are on screen, and how those relationships between the audience, watching the actors and watching Marcus. So that was what was really interesting about that project, because it was a different type of animation. Marcus was just supposed to be a regular chimp that was in this kind of situation. So we designed him to just look like a regular chimp, but a lot was done through the animation in the kind of comedic moments of, is Marcus getting it? Is he not getting it? You know, that was these little subtle things that the audience was to carry along the jokes that were for that series. So that was a fun project as well.
Now, do you get attached to any of the characters that you create, and do you have any favorites so far?
Oh, favorite characters. Actually, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, Apes, I would probably say it would be Maurice, the orangutan. He was, yeah, it was, yeah, I think that would be the one, because it was a challenge because of the look and the longer hair and just like his simple expressions on his face. Just the texture work that was done on him was amazing. And it's just, when I think about him, I think about the shots of him and Caesar sitting there kind of looking out over the rest of them and just talking. So I would say, yeah, I mean, no one's ever asked that before, but immediately that's what came to mind was Maurice. Yeah.
Yeah, the work that you've all done to make them so lifelike with such an emotional connection. Thank you. Now let's also talk a little bit about, you are working on the much anticipated Avatar sequels, including playing a role in the creation of digital water. Can you explain kind of what you're working on a little bit?
Yeah, I can't say much about
Okay.
the series, but for the last several years, we have been spending a lot of time working on our digital effects pipeline in general, and that includes water and fire and all those elements, but starting from scratch and really just going through all the physics and working with a whole team of physicists and programmers to rebuild our entire structure. So from the ground up, that those physics works really well for the artist, and they can spend more time focusing on telling the story of that effect and not as much chasing to make it look realistic. So that's been the last several years really working on that, which has been fun because I've learned even so much more about effects and effects programming.
Well, I will say that our friend and VES treasurer and former chair Jeff Oken is watching. So please
Yeah.
tell us what it was like working with that guy, Jeff Oken, on The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Yeah, it's funny that they bring up Jeff and Day the Earth Stood Still, because I was actually mentioning that the other day, because we had done Jeff and I, we were looking at all these different effects of how to do these kind of swarming things. And there were some effects that we ended up doing practically. We did, I think we were using cornflakes and we were blowing them in the air to get this kind of nice sparkle effects that we could add into one of our shots. And I was mentioning that to one of the artists the other day of how those things were very successful. So it was great working with Jeff because we were trying different things. We had these digital solutions, we had these practical solutions, and put them together for like a really fun piece. So yeah, and I haven't seen Jeff in years, but hopefully we'll catch up soon.
He says hello.
That's great.
Someone is asking, in your capacity as a VFX supervisor, do you ever wish, you were the artist working on, all of the shots, or how do you sort of balance your interest or your roles as a supervisor and an artist?
Yeah, it's also a good question, because as a supervisor, sometimes you do miss being back on the box, just getting there, making your stuff, because through some of my research, I've had a little bit of opportunity to do that with some of recent work. And there's a little bit of a buzz you get from, coding something up, kicking off a render and seeing what's that is like in the morning. And I think you only get that as much when you're actually doing it as an artist. You do get it definitely as a supervisor, but there's that extra personal touch you get by creating it yourself. So I do miss that sometimes. I try to do it when I can, but it's not easy.
someone in the chat was picking up on your comment about creating digital water and was mentioning The Last Airbender and some other films had great water. Do you have a favorite water scene so far that you've seen?
Water scene. Yeah, it's a tough one. Man, I may have to come back to that. I'm trying to think of, I like some of the stuff that was done on Life of Pi, and but I haven't actually, I haven't thought of it as much. It's a funny thing because I'm getting back into water now, and I originally started my career in effects, but for years I was focused so much more on creatures and environment. So this is something I'm just coming back to now. So I haven't been like focusing on water as much until the last couple of years, but it's a good question.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit more about diversity, which is something that you've spoken on a lot. I guess my first question is, when you look at the visual effects industry or the broader, filmed entertainment industry, what are you seeing that makes you concerned or hopeful about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in bringing people into the arena?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm hopeful about is that we're having more of this conversation. Over the last couple of years, this has become a point of more discussion, and so that part, I'm hopeful about. I'm seeing a lot of students entering the field, that are interested in visual effects. It's become more accessible through through some of the technology. Some of my concern and what I'm looking at through my own kind of investigations is, where do those students go after this? Like, I do see them in the universities, but I'm not seeing as many entering into the houses, or they maybe not going into the field. And then, and particularly trying to figure out what are those things that may be limiting some of the students from entering that. There's a lot of work going on in the houses and the different societies to increase inclusion. But like I said, my particular interest is at the beginning. Where does that happen? And is it, some of the students are not going to conferences like SIGGRAPH or FMX? Are they not applying to the houses? Is there anything we can be doing in the university programs for more encouragement, more mentorship? And is it possible also with that the arts programs are not getting as much applicants? And I think another thing that we've identified as well is that there may, even in the technical fields, I think a lot of people don't know about the different jobs that are available in visual effects. They hear about lighters and animators and modelers, but what I've been doing with a lot of my presentations is including, on-set work, art department, fur groomers, all these different careers. And the biggest response I've gotten is that many of the students said they never knew that they could have a job in digital grading and being a colorist. Like they just don't know about some of those career opportunities out there. So doing that, I think will help identify and help with our inclusion, working with the students in particular.
Thank you. A couple other questions. I mean, one thing I think we touched on, again, in terms of demystifying the world of visual effects, is that it can be a stable, profitable career. And what, accounting versus going into the arts, what kind of connotations they have. Can you talk a little bit from that perspective of the job?
Yeah. And that's one thing that I think is an important thing, is that, like you said, it can be a stable, going into the arts, it can be a stable, profitable career, like you mentioned, that it is a career path that ones can take, and maybe that this could be limiting if you're maybe a first generation university. Maybe you don't necessarily want to go into the arts because you think it might be a bit of a risk versus something that's more stable. So I think it's up to us to show that this is a long-lasting career, and there's a lot of jobs and opportunities out there, but it's getting that word out.
A few people are asking a little bit more about your journey. Are there any particular challenges you faced when you started out or along the way, that you have any lessons learned that you can share?
Yeah. You know, when I first got out of my undergrad, it was difficult to get in. Like I had just graduated. Everyone said I had a great portfolio. I was doing graduate level work, but at the time just could not find a job, you know, just nothing back at home. So that was a tough part. And that's when I took that moment to kind of regroup and did as much research as I could about all the different houses and work that was out there. I would go to the library every day and built this whole book of like everything from East Coast to West Coast, and then looked at all the internships, you know, and different things like that. And I hadn't gotten the ILM internship at the time. So I really sat and focused on what those would be and what internships I could do. So that was kind of it was a tough part in the beginning of my career, but it was kind of what I would encourage would be is really doing your research on to what opportunities are available to you and kind of building your, you know, list or your book of what you would like to go into. There's so much information that's out there now that wasn't at that time, that you could really use that to help kind of sculpt your career and reach out to people to get their advice, because there's a lot of people that are happy to advise the next generation of artists.
Sounds good. Another question. So, you know, this industry and the available, let's call it technology or resources, is changing rapidly right before our eyes. Do you have anything on the horizon that you're excited about for the future of visual effects, or any thoughts on where you think things are moving?
Yeah. Some of the things that I'm kind of interested is in these virtual production tools. I know you've been hearing a lot about that lately. I have interest in some of the AR tools and those things that can help with kind of planning out and shooting some of the real-time work that we're doing. Like that to me is pretty exciting because like that picture just showed, my background was actually in virtual reality originally. So, you know, and looking at, like I mentioned, those tools to help artists kind of realize what they're creating. So what's exciting for me is that these tools are becoming so fast now that we'll get the immediate interaction. And how with AR, like how do you bring that into the filming world? You know, how do you help the directors and the creatives see the environments that they're creating? So the virtual production is probably the next big thing that I think is going to be exciting.
Cool. We're definitely getting a bunch of questions. So,
Good.
are there any particular softwares or tools that are your favorites to work with?
Yeah, it's for me personally, I did a lot of my work in Maya, you know, coming up. I was working with Maya 1 all the way through, and the digital New York stuff that we talked about before was actually scripted, believe it or not, all in Mel, building all that up. So those, for me personally, that's some of the exciting tools, like, you know, the work that you can do in Nuke and some of the different compositing tools. Even with the traditional Photoshop I used to do my artwork, we sculpt some of our own proprietary tools in house, so we're always coding different things. Yeah, so it's kind of, there's a nice suite of different tools that you have out there. But for me personally, it's Maya is just kind of my my kind of go-to.
Well, I'm glad to hear we're getting some students and people at the early part of their career also asking some questions here. When you are looking to hire someone, um, do you ascribe kind of more value to experience and a good portfolio, or where they graduated from and where they went to school? How do those different factors play in?
Yeah. I look for a good portfolio, you know, and the experience is good as well, but also, if it's a lot, actually for me, is looking at their portfolio and the work and meeting with the artist. You know, is this someone that, you know, we're all going to be working together, and is, you know, there's a lot of collaboration. Is this someone who's going to work well with a group? You know, we look at that in terms of interviews. But there's one thing I actually look for in a portfolio, which sometimes people include and sometimes don't, is with all their digital work, I actually like seeing traditional work in the back of the portfolio. You know, you have your reel at the beginning, but I like seeing if there's drawings and there's sketches, things that will show what type of eye or your attention to color or detail. There's a couple of people I've hired in the past where the digital portfolio was pretty good, but then when I actually saw the artwork behind it, that really put it over the edge. Like, okay, they really have a good eye for composition and lighting and structure. So I would say I wouldn't be afraid to include those things at the end, some of your traditional work. And it's, you know, it's good to come through a good program, but I really look at the work and the artist and as the main things.
Another question we're getting is, where do you draw your inspiration from for your work? Are there things that you can point to in your life?
I draw it, I mean, for individual projects, I draw it from what I see around me, you know. I mean, you live in New Zealand, it's beautiful, and you're constantly, I'm like looking at some water right now. You're constantly pulling from that, but I also really, I love looking at some of the art directors and some of their portfolios and some of the traditional art that people are producing nowadays. I have a friend who actually just finds different artists and posts them on his Facebook page. And a lot of my inspiration comes from just seeing the different work that the traditional and digital artists are doing out in the field right now. There's such amazing stuff that people are doing with the most recent tools.
Got it. So yeah, these questions are going to bop around and keep you on your toes.
That's
We
fine.
were talking a little bit about diversity and what you are hopeful about. There is a question, you know, we've seen a lot of media coverage on what's happening in the awards process in terms of sort of the lack of diversity and I'm just wondering if there's anything you want to comment on in terms of what you're seeing in terms of the guilds or the other organizations and what work really needs to be done moving forward.
Yeah, I think with the guilds and the awards, it's good that the different societies have taken this on and they've gone through and they're looking at their programs, they're looking at how their membership is determined, how they reach out to different areas. So that part I think is encouraging because some of the lack of inclusion can just happen from the way procedures are set up or the way friends of friends, bring others into different societies. So having them look at those different aspects will help. And I think we need to continue to do that. Part of it is diversifying the houses and the educational programs and bringing more artists of inclusion into the work in general, because the societies can only diversify if there's people that they can bring in for that. And for the awards programs, I think a lot of that can continue to help and grow by reaching out and doing different types of projects, diverse projects, more inclusive projects. And then that gives a larger gamut of pieces that can be accessed and pulled from. But it's also, when those societies start to diversify, then you're voting, you have a lot of voters that are coming from different backgrounds, and that can help as well with the award program. So I think it has to happen from all different sides, from the students, from the education, from the houses, from the societies. We all have to take a look at it and encourage that growth.
Thank you. I mean, when you talked about being optimistic about the future, you talked about being encouraged by the work of Ryan Coogler. You talked about, I've seen you talk about Jordan Peele and other things. Are there other filmmakers or creatives that inspire you? And who is on your wish list that you would like to work with in the future?
Yeah, those names are definitely on the wish list. The things that I'm actually inspired about is seeing some of the other artists from different countries and some of the visual effects, like there's different countries in Africa, some of the artists through there's some Nigerian artists that were doing some visual effects. I'm actually with the whole streaming media now growing, and different companies showing features from outside into other venues. That's the part that's kind of drawing me. I really want to see student films from different places like that. Some of the next generation of artists or independent artists that will come up in streaming media, or even on their own individual independent platforms. Yeah, so that's kind of on the list. But yeah, Jordan Peele will be great. Yeah, I've always been into these kind of sci-fi, like Twilight Zone. I grew up watching a lot of Outer Limits and Twilight Zone and those different types of media. And I even said that in the article that you mentioned, that there wasn't a lot of inclusion at that time in those type of genres. So that's what's encouraging about Jordan Peele's work, and having diversity, but in these otherworldly type of genre, which I always liked.
Well, I'm watching Ava DuVernay's, Naomi, talk about, having diverse superheroes kind of like coming more to the forefront. Um, one of the things we've talked about with a lot of guests has been the change in workflows, the change in work that needed to happen the last year plus during the pandemic, in terms of how you work with colleagues, in many cases in a more virtual world. I know you talked a little bit about virtual production, but are there certain ways that you and your teams have been working the past year to kind of accommodate due to the pandemic that you have liked, that you think are going to also continue moving forward as things have shifted back a little bit? And I know you had it a little easier in New Zealand.
We've been very lucky in New Zealand, because it's our lockdown and was very short-lived. And so we haven't had it nearly as difficult. But there was, during that lockdown, which we had to do very quickly, it was, almost immediately, we were finishing up Space Force, I believe, in Umbrella Academy, and doing all that work through Teams and doing it remotely. It actually worked pretty well. But to your question of what could we take with us, I would love to see some of that continue, that kind of flexibility to be able to be in the office, but then to also be able to work remotely, take advantage of some of these tools. It's even been helpful when we're in the office to use a little bit more of this, with Teams and working together through having meetings, not as much driving back and forth and getting people into different rooms, like really taking advantage of that to make the days and the meetings more efficient, and to make the chats. And I think in general, there's been a lot of positive things that have come out of that ability. And also the ability to work remotely to just give you a little bit more of work, life balance, that that you can have time to go home and spend with your kids and back and forth, and just a little bit more flexibility with our ability to be in different places.
No, I appreciate that. And you did say the buzzword, like work-life balance, which comes up often in conversations in terms of, some people laugh, haha, can you have work-life balance working in this industry? The other thing that comes up is it's a very nomadic lifestyle in terms of following the work. I'm wondering if you could speak to both of those, just in terms of what it means to a lifestyle, in terms of people, again, looking to enter the field of visual effects and filmed entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I'm kind of interested to see what happens after this. Does that possibly change the remote working and the digital migrating, bouncing around? Will it open up more opportunities for artists to work for different companies from their home base versus having to move so much? So we'll see, how that evolves. Your second question was, how does artists entering the field?
I think other than work-life balance, there has been conversation in the last couple of years that it's a very nomadic lifestyle in terms of sort of chasing the work. You know, you
Yeah.
have been fairly stable, you know,
Yes.
in your career, working for 2 large companies for most of your career. Do you think that it is still that you have to sort of accept that it's kind of nomadic, or do you think that's changing at all?
Yeah, that's the part that I'm hopeful will change with some of this that we've learned from the pandemic, and that there will become more opportunities that artists don't have to move as much. That there, could possibly be more remote locations, but it could also be good as well for the industry in general, because it gives a wider pool of people that they can work with, versus the ones that are just in your area. And like you said, it can also be good for families to be able to not have to bounce around as much. So I'm hopeful that some of this will lead to that.
See, this is really like a full-on AMA here. Ask me anything. Dear Chris, do you
Yeah.
ever watch a film with things that you've created like Planet of the Apes, and you're both wowed at the work, but also look back at it now and see what you might have done differently? Do you tend to look back at your work and have a critical eye?
Yeah, the recently, because there's been a lot of discussion about career and career paths, I've had to go back and look at some things. And it's interesting because there's a mix of things. There's some things where you look back at, you're like, oh, I wish I would have fixed this or done this differently. But then there's other projects that you were so critical at the time, and then you look back and are like, oh, actually that looked pretty good. I think this year is the 25th anniversary of Twister. So there's been a lot of discussion about that. And all that stuff to me still looks great. It's funny, there's still one leaf that I animated that still kind of bugs me, that I see in one shot after all these years later. It's just one that blows by that still catches my eye. So it's a combination of both.
Got it. I'm looking to see what questions we haven't answered. There are a lot. We have, just to share with you, we definitely have a bunch of new students starting to study visual effects at schools.
Yeah.
And anything else you can share with people starting out as they're looking to sort of diversify their education, at this most early point in their career?
Can you repeat again? So what advice is it trying to diversify?
Do you have any tips for people who are just starting out studying visual effects that would be helpful in diversifying their education?
Yeah, I think it's a good question in diversifying their education part, because like I mentioned earlier, when you work on these projects, you bring in so much stuff. You could be doing rocks or doing mountains. So if you have the opportunity, along with your studying of visual effects or computer art, try to take some physics classes, try to take some geology classes, try to take any other classes, and don't be afraid to bring in some of those interests your personal interests that you have, because I guarantee there's somewhere in some show you're going to work on where if you like plants or ballet, or it's going to be applicable to your work. So cultivate those outside interests. You can definitely use them in your work. So I think about that in your early career. And then as you're going through and trying to figure out what your path is, use the things that you really like and gravitate toward them. But also you can use those classes where you're like, this was not fun, I do not like animating, and use that to kind of eliminate the things that you don't want to do. Like I knew early on, I just did not want to be an animator. It was not my thing. Yeah.
Got it. Sounds good. We've talked in a couple different capacities about demystifying visual effects from a career perspective.
Yeah.
One thing that we hear often from people is, I wish the viewing audience understood better kind of what we do, that it's not all explosions and it's the, in terms of the very obvious kind of effects that people see on screen, and so much of the work is invisible. Or we've talked about how the light hits, the hair on that ape in a certain way to make it look lifelike. Are there things that you wish the viewing public who enjoys all of these VFX driven projects could better understand about what the work behind it?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess there's almost two parts of that question. One part you touched on is like the subtleties, that we have to put into the work. And one of my colleagues gave a great presentation on how the way a highlight hits an eye, how it can convey certain emotions, like you said, like subtle things like that. If it's a little tight highlight or if it's a broad highlight, there's little creatures that we did in Valerian that were supposed to look super cute. So we borrowed from anime and did these little cutesy highlights whenever we lit them. So there's a lot of subtleties that go into the work, which the viewing audience, like I said, they look at the big explosions, but you look at films like Apes, very long moments of just staring at a character. But I also take that back to what we discussed about students' portfolios. Some of the best portfolios I saw were very subtle, I wouldn't say simple, but very subtle motion. Some of the best ones were not as whiz bang, but was just, I think there's one where it's this dog getting up and walking around and sitting down. Some of the best animation I had seen. And so putting that in your portfolio that you can do subtle things is also equally as valuable as big explosive things. And it's sometimes maybe even more.
Got it. Well, let me see. We are actually coming up. Let's see. Basically, we have a lot of just nice comments for you that aren't questions.
Okay.
Like Habib is on the line,
Yeah,
talking about your work on Twister, Star Wars,
Yeah.
and Perfect Storm. So various kudos from you, from people who are tuning in. I wanted to
Yes.
share.
No, that's great. Me and Habib go way back. Yeah. He was my original mentor when I was speaking about the old Twister days. But yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I guess so. As we're coming towards a close, when you think about the different kinds of people who are probably tuning in, who are on one end of the spectrum, kind of very early in their career, students or people along the way who might be thinking of a shift in their in their future, is there
Yeah.
anything else that you want to share? Kind of any lessons learned or anything that we maybe haven't talked about that you want to sort of impart in your final words of wisdom or humor?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of final words of wisdom. I mean, I guess looking across that spectrum, for the ones that are getting into it, it is, fun. It's a great career. It will expand your mind because of all the things you have to learn as part of it, which is a good thing. You're being pulled to learn all these different things that you may not have normally done in a different type of career. Anything to impart with it. It's been a fun career. It's been a good career. It's great to see all the like you mentioned, all the VES people that I've worked with over the years that have kind of popped up. So that's been fun about this talk. And I guess for other people looking to get into it, yeah, it could be a good career shift. I met someone the other day who had been working has been in the military for their whole life, and they were at one of our Netflix talks, and he came and talked to me, and we spoke for hours about getting into the field. So it'll be great to see him working in it one day.
Well, great. We're right on time. So I want to thank you for tuning in with us, Chris, from early morning in New Zealand. So thank you again to Chris White, Visual Effects Supervisor at Wētā Digital, for being our special guest today. And thank you for everybody who tuned in to our latest VES Autodesk Ask Me Anything VFX Pros Tell All webcast. And as you see on your screen, to view today's webcast and learn more about the VES and Autodesk, you can visit these websites and these social media handles. If you enjoyed today's conversation, stay tuned. We will be announcing shortly our next guest in the series, and we hope that you will come back for more engaging conversation. So with that, I will say thank you and have a great rest of the day, Chris.
Thanks, Naomi. Thanks, everybody.
And so that's a wrap. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.